Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Portal 2 for PC, Mac, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This review is coming to you courtesy of Lex. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is the sequel to the original Portal, which was, of course, the physics-based platform puzzle game thingy that I wasn't really a huge fan of. I didn't hate it either, but a lot of people seem to think that for some bizarre reason. I thought that it wasn't that great considering that you did have to pay money for it, and unless you got it in, say, the orange box or something like that, it really didn't justify the price. So, it was a really short game, it had a really cool concept, it had a great sense of humor, but at the same time, it did have flaws, like the puzzles being way too easy, and of course, it just being so ridiculously short. So when I heard about Portal 2, I was just kind of skeptical. In fact, I wasn't just kind of skeptical, I was very skeptical about it. Because, like I said, I didn't really like the original Portal all that much, and I hoped they had fixed the problems that Portal 1 had. But at the same time, I was like, they probably didn't. So the real question there is, were the problems that they had in Portal 1 resolved, or did something else entirely happen? As far as the presentation goes, it is a step up from the original game, although the original didn't look bad by any stretch of the imagination. It just looked really sterile, and it was supposed to. It was supposed to look like a test environment. And this one is a very different feel altogether. Even though there is that test chamber feel in a lot of it, they threw in this atmosphere where the facility had just fallen into disrepair over the course of time between Portal 1 and Portal 2. And you really see the evidence of that. There's a lot of corroded metal and such like that, just all over the place. There's plants coming through the holes in the test chambers and such like that. And so it looks a great deal different from the original Portal, and at the same time still has that kind of science-y testing feel. And it doesn't look bad by any stretch of the imagination. It just doesn't look particularly impressive. Now, this is not a bad thing. They did throw in a lot more color in this one. The original was a lot of white and gray and not much else, and in this one they threw in a lot more colors, and that is certainly greatly appreciated. It really lends a great sense to the visual feel. But at the same time, this change in visual style is really what propelled the visuals forward, even though they are not particularly impressive from a technical standpoint or from a quality standpoint. They look like a high-end console game, and that's fine. And especially considering that the game runs so well. It runs wonderfully. Even though my system is, of course, mid-range in 2008, it still runs this thing on absolute highest settings without really any trouble until I get to the gels. And that's only because of physics problems. So, the performance and the visual quality of this game, excellent. What about the sound design? Well, they did a really good job with that as well, particularly the voice acting. The voice acting in this game is phenomenal. Did a wonderful job with it. The characters give this great sense of humor to the game. There's certain ones that just sound rather silly, like Wheatley and Cave Johnson. And then there's, of course, GLaDOS being GLaDOS, and you don't really need to say much about that. It's freaking GLaDOS. But they really did a great job of adding to this game as far as everything goes. I mean, it would be a really boring game if the characters were not as well voiced and interesting as they are. So, great voice acting. Sound effects themselves, average. They don't really need to be anything more than that, though. It fits the game very well, and it works out okay. And the music is pretty much a continuation of the kind of stuff you heard in the original Portal, and it's still good. I mean, it's nothing amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but it does fit the game fairly well, and it's just there. You don't really notice it until it really gets loud. So, it's certainly nice to have. As far as the presentation in general goes, they did a great job with it. But ultimately it comes down to the story and the gameplay, and these were where I really had trouble with the original game. The original game was mostly a tech demo, so it didn't really have much of a storyline. It was there, but it was more of a, you kind of have to fill in all the blanks as you go through. You don't really know much of what's going on. You're just kind of there, going along with it. In this one, the story takes a much, much bigger role. You learn a lot more about aperture science. You learn a lot more about characters that you're introduced to, like Wheatley, for instance, who is the blue core that is kind of goofy and silly and is trying to help you escape, as well as, of course, GLaDOS, who you're reintroduced to. And it's an interesting storyline, which really surprised me. I wasn't expecting the story to actually be interesting, but it was. Mostly because it's so silly. The game has a great sense of humor, and the entire time you're going through it, you're just constantly encountering all these quips and sarcastic remarks and just ridiculous things like potato batteries. What? And it's just this really great sense of humor that really propels you through the game more than much else, actually. So, by the end of the game, I was finding that I was more interested in the humor and the actual story than I was in anything else in this game. Now, that should tell you something about the gameplay. I'm not a huge puzzle game fan, and that really didn't help with the original Portal. It was a lot of really simple physics-based puzzles. This game is pretty much the same. For the vast majority of this game, it's pretty simple physics-based puzzles that are not particularly difficult to figure out. You still have to place portals, you have to use momentum to actually get to things, place things on buttons, redirect lasers. They do introduce some new mechanics, though, and those were actually pretty interesting. I was really pleasantly surprised by those. And one of these is, of course, the gels, which actually presented a problem for me, not because the concepts were too hard to grasp or anything. They were actually pretty simple to grasp. It was that whenever the gels would pop up, my performance would tank. And that's mostly because it's a very strict physics-based processing, and it really just takes a lot of toll on your system. At least it took a lot of toll on my system. If you have a beefier system than what I've got, you shouldn't have any trouble with it at all. But it's weird going from really good performance all of a sudden to really crappy performance just because there's a lot of gel in an area. But it did create a pretty interesting way of playing the game. There is blue gel, which, of course, makes you bounce, and you can also put it on objects, and that will make them bounce. The orange gel, which is speed gel, and then there's also gel to create portals on. So it provides an interesting way of playing the game. You have to really pay more attention to what you're doing, and there's some puzzles that actually make you think, which blew my mind. The original Portal had no puzzles that actually made you think. This one has a few. The vast majority of puzzles are still very simple to figure out and will not leave you scratching your head. This one, there are a couple of those, but they really aren't that prevalent. They're really towards the end of the game where you had to combine everything into one. So ultimately, the puzzles actually aren't that difficult, but there are a few that will make you take more time on them, and as a result, the game actually ends up being a lot longer than the original Portal. I beat the original Portal in about an hour and a half. It's an extremely short game. This one is more like 5 hours, maybe. So it's actually a full single-player campaign as far as the length goes. It's not a particularly long game, but it luckily doesn't overstay its welcome. Although I will admit, towards the end of the game, I was having a lot of trouble actually getting interested in the gameplay. Just because I don't like physics-based puzzles, and it was really starting to wear on me. So, I was lucky it ended when it did. But there is an additional thing for this game, and that is the co-op mode. Now, the co-op mode is actually pretty interesting, because not only are you each working on 2 different portals, meaning you have a total of 4 portals that you can use, but you can also grief the other player, which is usually pretty amusing, actually. So, it's actually a pretty fun mode to get your buddy playing that you constantly like just messing with, and when you just constantly mess with them in Portal 2, it's rather amusing. But at the same time, the gameplay is still pretty much the same as the base Portal 2 as far as single player goes, and you won't really be stumped by any of the puzzles. It's really more of a matter of tricky execution than it is actually confusing puzzles. So it's something that's kind of weird. You go from the single player, which has a few puzzles here and there that are actually pretty tricky to actually figure out as well as to execute. And in the co-op mode, there aren't really any puzzles that are particularly difficult to figure out. It's that they're difficult to execute because you have to both do this thing in tandem. So it's certainly an interesting way to play, and it's got some kind of cool features in it. Of course, the gestures kind of being amusing, and of course more of the Portal humor. But at the same time, it doesn't really add all that much to the game. It does add, of course, a couple of hours of gameplay, but of course the co-op campaign is much shorter than the single player is. And so it feels more like it was kind of tacked on than it does a natural part of this game. Even though it is a competent mode, and if you really like Portal, you'll probably like the co-op mode in this. Particularly if you have a friend that you really want to mess with. But ultimately, I had one major problem with Portal, and that was that it was really boring. Because I don't like puzzle games, and I don't like physics puzzles. And the same thing happened with Portal 2. It's just a personal thing. I don't really like puzzle games. Now, in this particular instance, it was certainly better than the original Portal. And that no one should argue that. If you liked the original Portal, you will definitely like Portal 2. There's no question of that. If you didn't like Portal 1, you might like Portal 2, but I doubt it, because the gameplay is almost exactly the same kind of thing. In fact, some of the puzzles are almost exactly the same, particularly early in the game. So, it's kind of a weird situation where I can recommend it to Portal fans, and I can recommend it to people who like physics-based puzzles, but if you're like me and you don't particularly like those, and you didn't particularly like the original Portal, I can't really recommend it. It's a weird situation. It is better than the original Portal, there's no question of that. So, ultimately, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.